All right, let's dive in. Today, we're breaking down a sermon that asks a pretty huge question. How do you find hope when everything feels dark? It frames this whole struggle as, you guessed it, an impossible mission.
So let's start there. Have you ever been in a situation that just felt impossible? A moment where the odds are so completely stacked against you, you don't even know where to begin.
To really get us in that headspace, the sermon uses a great example. Top Gun Maverick. Remember that mission? It's so dangerous that even with the best pilots on the planet and a flawless plan, it's still considered a one-way trip. It's the perfect metaphor for feeling totally hopeless.
Okay, so that high-stakes movie mission, it's really just the warm-up act. It's a way to launch us into the real-life impossible mission the sermon wants to talk about, trying to navigate a world that, let's be honest, often feels broken, a world it describes as being in darkness.
Now, the source gets right to the point and names the root of this darkness with one word: sin. But it's not just talking about little mistakes here and there. It's defining it as this deeper condition, a state of rebellion against God that, according to the sermon, affects every single one of us. And what's really crucial to understand here is the scale of the problem. This isn't something new. The sermon traces it all the way back to the beginning, to the story in Genesis 3. It's talking about a fundamental fracture in the world that we are still dealing with today. And that brings us right to the main point, the absolute core of the entire message. After laying out this massive, universal problem, the sermon says, look, there is only one solution, and that solution is Jesus. So how exactly does that work? Well, the first piece of the puzzle, the first part of the solution, is presented as this incredibly powerful guiding light. The whole idea is built on this famous line from the Gospel of John. It's a direct quote from Jesus where he says, "I am the light of the world." He's basically offering a way out of that darkness we were just talking about for anyone who chooses to follow him. But to really get why this was such a bombshell statement, the sermon gives us some amazing context. Jesus said this during a huge festival in Jerusalem called the Feast of Booths. And get this, every night of the festival, they would light up 4 gigantic 70-foot-tall lampstands that would literally light up the entire city. Can you imagine seeing that? And then, in the middle of it all, a man stands up and says, No, I am the light of the world. The sermon explains that for everyone listening, that statement would have immediately clicked. It would have reminded them of the story of the pillar of fire that guided their ancestors through the desert at night. The connection was obvious. Just like that fire was a physical guide through the dark, Jesus was claiming to be the spiritual guide for all of humanity. So, okay, this light isn't just for looking at, it's for following. And that brings us to the next piece of the solution, the idea of trusting a master's plan, even when you can't see the whole picture. This is where the sermon talks about Jesus as a sovereign king. And what that really means is that even when life feels completely chaotic and out of control, there's a belief that a divine plan is at work and everything is unfolding exactly as it should. And to explain this, it uses a brilliant analogy from the Karate Kid. Remember, Daniel just thinks he's doing chores for Mr. Miyagi. Paint the fence, sand the floor, wax on, wax off. He feels like he's being used, and none of it makes sense until that moment he realizes all those boring tasks were actually training him, building the muscle memory he needed for karate. It's a perfect picture of trusting the process, even when the individual steps seem pointless. To back this idea up, the sermon points to this line that keeps popping up in the text. People are trying to arrest Jesus, to stop him, but they just can't. And the reason given is because his hour had not yet come. The point is, events are moving on a divine schedule, not a human one. And that idea of a divine timetable, of a master plan, leads us right to the climax of the whole argument, the one specific event that is supposed to solve the entire problem of sin and darkness. The message puts a very clear choice on the table, pulling it straight from the text. It's basically a fork in the road. On one side, you have the problem. You will die in your sin. And on the other, the solution, unless you believe that I am He. It's framed as a life and death decision. So what is the belief in? What's the central act of this whole plan? The sermon highlights Jesus' words about being lifted up, and it explains that this was a direct, though veiled, reference to being lifted up on a cross. The crucifixion is presented as the ultimate payment, a kind of ransom, for all the sin that plunged the world into darkness in the first place. Okay, so we've talked about the problem and this one-time ultimate solution. But then what? The sermon wraps up by shifting to the what now. What does all of this mean for the day-to-day life of someone who believes it?
And it breaks us down into two big ideas. The first is justification. That's described as a one-time gift. It's salvation secured completely by what Jesus did, not by anything you could ever do. But then there's sanctification, and that's the lifelong, day-by-day process of learning and growing and becoming more like Him. So you could say one is the moment you start the journey, and the other is the journey itself.
And that really brings us full circle. The entire sermon, with its impossible missions and guiding lights, all boils down to this one final personal question. It's no longer just an explanation. It's something to think about. What does it really mean to follow a light in the darkness?